Well, I think I'll get started. I assume most people have come from the introduction session. Welcome to this session, which is titled, Is the Endangered Species Act Endangered? Recent Developments and Threats. I'm Tom Sherry, the moderator. I'm in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology here at Tulane, and also in the Taylor Center for Social Innovation and Design Thinking. I thought I would take a few minutes to make some introductory remarks, some of which will be very familiar to many of you. The Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973 during the golden age of environmental law, when many other very powerful environmental legislation was passed during the Richard Nixon era with strong bipartisan support. There was protection for air, water, wildlife, endangered species, and so on. Since then, particularly in the 1980s and accelerating during the Reagan era, there has been continual efforts to undermine and weaken the impact of the Endangered Species Act. This is part of arguably an agenda to reduce restrictions on private landowners and governments' abilities to regulate activities that conflict with wildlife. I thought I would mention very briefly, last year we talked about the sage grouse case in a similar session to this. And as many of you know, there has been an extraordinary effort involving state governments, federal governments, and private landowners and others to come up with a plan to protect the sage grouse outside of the Endangered Species Act. In other words, without listing the sage grouse and without kicking in the regulations of the Endangered Species Act. The sage grouse made the unfortunate mistake of putting its habitat widely distributed in sagebrush and other areas in the western United States, where it turns out there's a lot of fossil fuels and opportunities for fracking in Wyoming, Montana, Nevada, and other states. And I'm mentioning that because I think the sage grouse case epitomizes the conflict between humans and our desires to extract fossil fuels, grow the economy, and so on, and wildlife. And that's a conflict that's playing out in terms of the tug of war between people who want to protect endangered species and those who want to develop areas and grow the economy. I will also mention that this conflict extends even to environmental organizations that have as the mission statement protecting wildlife, but a number of organizations have received money from fossil fuel companies, and so arguably there are conflicts of interest over fossil fuels. So I hope that will come up in a discussion, but I'm not a lawyer. I'm a biologist passionate about protecting endangered species, but you came here to hear the lawyers. So with that, I'd like to introduce first Patrick Parenteau, who's a professor of law and senior counsel in the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Clinic at the Vermont Law School. So welcome.
Thank you. Improvisational.
Okay, that's fine. Jason Rhinelander is a senior attorney with the Defenders of Wildlife. So welcome, Jason.
He's better looking anyway. So.
Patrick's the main event, so I'll be the warm-up act. No, I appreciate Professor Sherry's remarks, and I think they set up fairly well some of the things that I want to talk about, which is largely the environment that we're living in, the importance of the Endangered Species Act, and some of the threats that the Act faces in this current political environment. Good. I don't usually start off this way, but the LCV scorecard, League of Conservation Voters, does a scorecard every year of how people voted in Congress, and it just came out this week, and I was pawing through it. And while I live the polarization of Washington pretty much every day, I read these numbers and it kind of blew my mind. So I thought it would be a good way to set up what I'm going to be talking about. 46 Republican senators received a score of 0 in 2017, meaning that they voted against the environment as defined by the votes selected by LCV at every single opportunity. 27 Democrats earned 100. The Senate average for Democrats was 93%. The average for Republicans was 1%. The House side was no better. Where are the moderates in this? Well, the Climate Solutions Caucus that we hear about sometimes, where a Democrat and a Republican have to join together in order to become part of the Climate Solutions Caucus. There are now 68 members. Of the 34 Republicans, their LCV average is 16%. That is such a stark contrast to where we used to be. Back in 1973, the Endangered Species Act passed the Senate 92 to nothing, and the House of Representatives by 355 to 4. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, NEPA, all these laws passed Congress by wide margins. The notion of citizen enforcement of environmental laws was part of the congressional design. Democrats and Republicans both understood what former Senator James Buckley, no liberal, once said in defending the Endangered Species Act, that conservation should be a conservative value. I came to D.C. 1992, 1993. It's been almost 25 years. Back then, we were talking about reauthorizing the Endangered Species Act and talking about ways that we might be able to improve it for the benefit of wildlife. The environmental community made a decision that they would hold out for a better Congress in 1994. That was the year Newt Gingrich took over with a contract with America, and we started having words like government shutdown come into our lexicon. And it has not gotten better since. Now, that said, the Endangered Species Act has survived a lot of assaults, a lot of attempts to undermine it, starting with that effort in 1994. It survived attempts by Richard Pombo in 1995. It survived attempts by Doc Hastings and Cynthia Loomis with their ESA Congressional Working Group. Been many, many efforts over the time that I've been in Washington to try to change the Endangered Species Act, and not usually for the better. And each time the act has emerged unscathed. And why is that? Well, I think it's because the act has been a success. And at the end of the day, the American people, by and large, overwhelmingly support it. This is a quote from Newt Gingrich from 2008. And I think it's pretty apt. The Endangered Species Act is often considered one of the crown jewels of our environmental laws and one of the most effective pieces of environmental legislation in our history. Any attempts to weaken it should be resisted. So let's talk a little bit about some of those successes. The protection of the Endangered Species Act were instrumental in saving hundreds of species from the brink of extinction, from the grizzly bear to the gray wolf to the bald eagle, the black-footed ferret, and many others. Out of the nearly 2,000 plants and animals that are protected under the Act, only 10, roughly, have gone extinct, a success rate of close to 99%. There are a variety of studies that talk about the Endangered Species Act's effectiveness. The longer a species has been on the list, the better it tends to be doing. If there's a recovery plan, it tends to be doing better. If it's received funding, it tends to be doing better than some of the others. Those that have received that attention, by and large, are doing better, even in an era where habitat destruction continues and climate change portends a no-analog future. The number of ESA delistings due to recovery is up to about 46, with 28 of them occurring during the Obama administration. More recoveries were declared during the Obama administration than any other time. But as important as those that are delisted, and a lot of people like to use that as a marker of the success, I think it's the fact that so few have actually gone extinct that we need to remember. The ESA is often analogized to an emergency room. And by the time a species gets through the regulatory process to be listed, it may be down to a very few number of species, and it may take a great deal of work. And some of those species may be conservation reliant, meaning that they're going to require active management of their habitat or their propagation or reintroduction in order for them to survive. So it's a remarkable success record. And the workload has continued to get bigger every time. This chart just shows the total number of species that are listed and when they were listed. There have been some big drops. They tend to correspond to the political administration in office at the time. You can see a big drop around 1995. There was a listing moratorium at that point. There was a slow walk of listings during the George W. Bush administration. That prompted conservation groups to file a lot of mega petitions and to challenge a growing list of species that were deemed to be warranted for listing but precluded by a lack of funds or other priorities. More than 1,230 species have been petitioned for listing since 2007. So it's a lot of increased workload for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Another chart kind of shows the same thing. The number of listed species just in recent years continues to grow. 500 species on the list in 1998. Now we're close to 1,700 domestic species. And all this at the time that Fish and Wildlife Service budgets have been flatlined for the most part. A lot of that has been driven, as indicated, by these listing petitions and a series of litigation that led to some settlements that helped the Fish and Wildlife Service develop a listing plan for how they were going to deal with the number of species that potentially required listing. The settlements have expired now, but they have resulted in many, many decisions regarding endangered species. And by and large, I think most people, both within the service and within the conservation community, agree that they have worked fairly well and helped get the service on track for dealing with the backlog of species that need to be considered for listing. This work plan that they had was a 7-year plan and came out of the Obama administration. It was a way that they were going to identify listing decisions, critical habitat decisions for 360 species, the remaining candidates, and it was going to take us through the next 7 years. All that now is a bit in limbo, as I'll get to. We saw some pretty significant decisions around the Endangered Species Act in 2017. There were 5 species delisted, 4 of which allegedly due to recovery. They include the Northern Rockies gray wolf, which actually was congressionally mandated, but the species has done well. The Yellowstone grizzly DPS, the distinct population segment, was delisted, but that's being challenged in court. There were 2 species of parakeet delisted due to recovery, and the 5th one was I can never say this correctly, Hualapai Mexican vole. It was delisted due to a classification error. And there were some other decisions as well. The West Indian manatee was downlisted to threatened. At the same time, 11 species were added to the list, including the rusty-patched bumblebee, the pearl darter, which is found in Mississippi, a couple species of dolphin, a bird called the iwi, and the Sonoida mud turtle. So far this year, there's already been a couple of endangered species listings, including the black warrior water dog, a little aquatic critter that's found in Alabama. But there's also, in October, there was a decision by the Fish and Wildlife Service to reject listing for 25 species, including the Pacific walrus and the Northern Rocky Mountain fisher, which is a species that I helped petition to list. So those are likely to be under litigation. And there are a number of other initial reviews of species that the service is going to have to consider in the next few years, including a decision on the lesser prairie chicken, which was subject to a great deal of litigation. There was a court in the Western District of Texas that ordered the service to go back and reconsider the listing of that species on the basis of conservation plans that the states had developed, similar to the sage grouse situation that Professor Sherry mentioned. The service was supposed to have issued a decision on that by this past fall, and they did not. So we will see what happens with the lesser prairie chicken. So let me get to the elephant in the room, and I mean no disrespect to elephants, but this is our current reality. Now, I mentioned the situation with Congress, but these times are really unprecedented in my career. Donald Trump is the 45th President of the United States. His appointees, Scott Pruitt heads the EPA, Ryan Zinke heads Interior, the chairman of Exxon is our Secretary of State, and Republicans control both houses of Congress. If you had asked me or a lot of others in Washington what our outlook for conservation was after the election, we might have looked a bit like that. We were scared, we were shocked, we were unsure of what was going to happen, but we also knew that we were, we had the tools, we had the resources, we fought these battles before, and we were hopeful that we might be able to persevere. If you ask me now how I'm feeling, it's a bit like this. While the ESA has so far survived intact, the sheer number and scope of this administration's attacks on the environment and public lands is unlike anything I have seen before. The New York Times in October listed 60 environmental rules on the way out, and there's more than that now. They include ending offshore drilling bans in the Arctic and the Atlantic, revoking a ban on seismic testing in the Atlantic, revoking anti-dumping rules for coal companies, ending the freeze on new coal leases on public lands, ending mining restrictions in Bristol Bay, Alaska, ending the 2016 order protecting biodiversity in the Bering Sea, ending flood standards for federal infrastructure projects, approving the Keystone and Dakota Access pipelines, scrapping guidance requiring consideration of greenhouse gases in environmental reviews, eliminating a directive that federal agencies mitigate the environmental impacts of projects they approve, squelching the Bureau of Land Management's public land use planning process, overturning a ban on lead ammunition on public lands, administratively eviscerating the Migratory Bird Treaty Act's protections on incidental take. If the Obama administration approved it, they've gone after it, no matter how petty. They even rescinded a ban on plastic water bottles in sales in national parks that had significantly decreased the amount of plastic litter in our parks. And I haven't even mentioned some of the things that are still in the works, like building the border wall with serious impacts to endangered species along the border, repealing the Clean Power Plan, withdrawing from Paris, rescinding the Waters of the United States rule under the Clean Water Act, rolling back CAFE standards, modifying or shrinking national monuments like Bears Ears, reviewing and presumably shrinking marine protected areas, reviewing rules on the disposal of coal ash waste, safeguards on offshore drilling that were put in place after Deepwater Horizon, rescinding water pollution regulations for fracking on federal lands, ending a restriction on drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Each week has brought another one of these punches to the gut. So, last year, in the last Congress rather, there were 127 Anti-Endangered Species Act measures that were introduced that we track, and we have this chart that we maintain on Defender's website that our government affairs staff looks at. And so far we're tracking 69 bills and riders this year, so it's a potential for more. We saw important environmental riders inserted into the tax bill in December. That's how they managed to end the 40-year ban on drilling and leasing in the Arctic refuge. There's always these sort of must-pass omnibus legislation that gets put forward, and at any point something could show up in one of those bills. And what kind of tax am I talking about? And this is generally what we have seen, and this isn't new. We've seen this in a lot of different Congresses. It's just that this is the year that some of these could actually pass. A tax on citizen enforcement and access to the courts is always a big hit. They don't like us lawyers going out and suing to try to protect the environment, and in some cases getting fees for doing so. Use of science under the Endangered Species Act. What constitutes good science? That's another one. A tax on the new critical habitat rules that the Obama administration put into place. They tried to inject economic considerations in listing decisions and also delegate more authority to the states. These attacks can take a lot of different forms. Sometimes you'll see attacks on ESA protections for particular geographic areas. If there's a drought in California, there may be specific efforts to try to undo endangered species protections there. Or there may be attacks on specific species, like riders that prevent the listing of the lesser prairie chicken, or force a delisting of a gray wolf. And of course, Congress always has oversight potential. Well, they haven't maybe used that to their fullest in this Congress. That's something else we always have to be aware of. So I'm just going to run through a few of the things we're looking at. There's some must-pass legislation coming up that will probably include a delisting proposal for the Great Lakes population of gray wolves. That one actually has some bipartisan support from legislators in the Great Lakes area. We've got this one called the Listing Reform Act. This is interesting. This one eliminates the 90-day finding in the Endangered Species Act. As some of you may know, when you petition to list, the service is supposed to issue a 90-day finding that says, is there enough in this petition that we need to go ahead and look a little bit further at whether the species warrants listing or not. If they pass the 90-day threshold, then you get to a 12-month finding where you make a warranted or not warranted finding, and if you make a warranted finding, then you have a year to propose a rule to list the species. Well, this one eliminates the 90-day finding and it replaces the 12-month finding with a requirement that the findings be made as expeditiously as possible, meaning never. So without those deadlines, which Congress put into the Act in amendments in the 80s, there's no way to say exactly when the service would have to act on the species petition. They would also allow the service to decline to list a species if the listing itself was deemed to have economic impacts. That is completely contrary to the way the Act is structured. The Act is structured to list a species based on its biological status. And economic impacts can come into play later on when you're designating critical habitat or when you're determining the amount of protection that the species gets if it's a threatened species, for example, under a Section 4D rule. So this one would definitely strike at the heart of the Act. That one has passed a House committee already, so it could end up in some legislation somewhere. We have this one, which subverts the ESA's requirement that listings be based on the best available science. It simply declares that any information provided by states, tribes, or counties is the best available science. Well, that's interesting. That one's also been marked up and could appear. You know, I think it's a good opportunity to say a word about the states. And you know, every state has an Endangered Species Act of some kind on the books, but they vary very significantly in their quality. And you know, what this chart shows is that there are enormous gaps in the amount of resources that states have to devote to endangered species programs as compared to the amount of resources that the federal government, which is already hardly providing enough, spends. It's a fraction of what the federal wildlife agencies spend annually to conserve endangered species. There was a new study in 2016 by the University of California at Irvine, and that showed that states' spending to protect endangered and threatened wildlife over 10 years, ending in 2014, was negligible compared to federal spending. It was $57 million versus $1.1 billion. So when states talk about turning over management of endangered species to the states, what are they planning to do? And with what funds? And with what agencies? This is just the spending in the Western Governors Association states where we tend to hear that argument the most. Funding's actually decreased in a lot of those states. Only a couple of those states, Washington and California namely, put significant amount of resources into endangered species spending. Some exceptions, the sage grouse planning process, things like that, there have been considerable state initiative, but it's not the same. Another bill, this is the Saving Endangered Species Act, the most Orwellian named of the bills we're currently watching. It has nothing to do with saving American species. It's a gift to foreign traffickers and trophy hunters. It would eliminate protections for individual animals of listed foreign species in the United States. It's a canned hunting issue. That one's been marked up. We have the Endangered Species Litigation Reasonableness Act. This one limits fee recovery to equal access to justice amounts as opposed to the amounts that could ordinarily be recovered under the citizen suit provision of the Endangered Species Act. I call this one the be careful what you wish for plan because you know, most environmental attorneys on my side get a salary. Fees aren't as important to us as one might think. So, you know, in the Ninth Circuit, the Equal Access to Justice Act calls for $197 an hour. Most people in private practice haven't billed at that lower rate since they were first years. So it may actually end up hitting industry lawyers a little harder than it will us. But nonetheless, you know, that's still this thing we're seeing. And this one, this is the Native Species Protection Act. This one, another Orwellian named one, eliminates ESA protection for species that reside in a single state and are not traded in interstate commerce. So just this past year, the 10th Circuit decided another case called the PETPO. It's the People for Ethical Treatment of Property Owners versus the government. And it was a challenge to the protection of the Utah prairie dog. Utah prairie dog resides only in Utah. It's not particularly traded in commerce. The argument that was made in that case was, and Patrick may speak to this, I don't know, so I won't say much more because he's going to get into Supreme Court cases, but you know, that it violates the Commerce Clause. And I just argued a case literally 2 weeks ago in Austin involving a little critter called the bone cave harvestman, which is a arachnid that's only found in a little cave in Texas, and once again somebody's making the argument there too that it doesn't meet the constitutional muster. So this is an argument that keeps coming up. It's been rejected in 6 circuits. I think it's bogus, but it keeps coming up. This would make it so. This would make it part of the law that the Endangered Species Act can only protect species that are economically valuable. And what is that? That defeats the entire purpose of the Act, which is to protect the known and unknown values of all of America's biodiversity. It would strip protection for nearly 68% of the species that are now listed on the ESA. So I've mentioned that, the constitutional challenges. This is what else we're looking at. I think Pat's going to talk again about Weyerhaeuser versus the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This is a case challenging the dusky gopher frog critical habitat. I'll let him talk about that, but we'll all be involved in this one. Anytime an Endangered Species Act case gets up to the Supreme Court, we are notably concerned. We've got the border wall. This is a case I'm now involved in. We have a number of waivers that have to all environmental laws for construction of the border wall along the Texas-Mexican and New Mexican, the southern border. All the states are involved. We are expecting administrative policies to come out, proposals to either eliminate the 2015 critical habitat rules that define adverse modification. We're expecting some reforms, I use that word loosely, to Section 7's consultation regulations. As I noted, we could see a number of species-specific actions. I'm involved in litigation over the red wolf in the southeast. The last wild population of red wolves is in North Carolina. The service is supposed to draw a conclusion as to the fate of that reintroduction program. It was highly successful until they mostly abandoned their efforts, and the population of wolves has crashed from about 150 down to as little as 28. We could see riders, as I noted, on gray wolves. We could see challenges to the listing of the Canada lynx. There's already been a species status assessment that's come out that suggested that maybe the lynx shouldn't be listed. Lesser prairie chicken and sage grouse are two big, wide-ranging species that we are expecting to see some action on. We could see listing decisions just simply not happening under this administration. That's happened before. That will probably lead to more litigation in the future. There's a potential for a waiver in the Farm Bill. It would eliminate the need for the EPA to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service over the adverse impacts of pesticides. There's an effort to strip ESA considerations from the Federal Emergency Management Association's dealing of flood issues. There's the Arctic Refuge and all the public lands fights that we're dealing with, and many of those have very significant impacts on endangered species preservation. Polar bears for sure, but not just polar bears. And I mentioned the Migratory Bird Treaty Act incidental take problem, which we can talk about maybe later. It's been a big year for us. Certainly this is how I feel a good deal of the time. You know, but I do have some hope because there are a lot of signs that politicians are overreaching. And, you know, we are seeing a growing, I hope, movement of people, not just around climate, but particularly around climate, that are increasingly demanding that we take some action. The concern is that with so many threats, both to the Endangered Species Act and to other wildlife and wilderness issues that we hold dear, there are going to be some casualties along the way and some special places that we will lose. So let me just wrap up with this. Wallace Stegner said that we are the only species which, when it chooses to do so, will go to great effort to save what it might destroy. And I think the question right now is whether we still choose to do so, certainly whether our politicians choose to do so in this era that we're calling the sixth extinction. And unlike the previous five, this one didn't need to happen. It's entirely man-made. There was no meteorite. There was no ice age. The cause is indifference. And each year, more species are added to the ESA list, and many more probably should be added. The 2014 Living Planet Index claims the Earth has lost 52% of the animals that once roamed the planet. And we barely touched on climate change. So even without today's politics, our work is harder. And we should be having discussions about how to make the Endangered Species Act better. But in this political environment, simply holding back the tide is all we can do. So, you know, I think E.O. Wilson has it right. There are some things that are unforgivable, that cannot be undone if we do not want to leave behind a diminished Earth. So I will stop there on that dismal note and hope that Pat can rally the cause.
Okay, now I have the privilege and pleasure of introducing Patrick Parenteau, the Professor of Law and Senate Counsel, Senior Counsel in the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Clinic at Vermont Law School.
Thank you. Welcome. Thanks very much, Tom. Whatever they're paying you, Jason, is not enough.
That's true.
I don't know about you all, but did you get the feeling listening to Jason that is there a
The remote not working, so you're just going to use the arrow keys.
okay?
Or the mouse works, you just click the mouse.
Cool. Did you get the feeling like you'd kind of like to draw a warm bath and get out the razor blades?
That mindfulness talk
feeling.
needed.
You know, Aldo Leopold said the price of those who not only study nature and ecology, but want to preserve it is to live in a world of wounds. So, we're in a world of wounds. And it sucks. But we're not wimps, are we? Ready to quit? Jean-Michel, are we ready to quit? Jean-Michel is still diving. You're going to see what Jean-Michel's doing at 80 years old. Hope I could do that. I'm barely able to walk through the Sonoran Desert, which I did last week with my wife, looking for trogons, which Oliver doesn't care for because they grunt, he says. So what I'd like to do is actually suggest that we still have some fight left in us. And we still have the courts. And yeah, by God, we still do have the rule of law. And we're not ready to give it up. And no matter how many losses we may suffer along the way, we'll suffer a lot more if we don't resolve to fight, the good fight. And if that's what's called for, then the question is, what has been the track record of the Endangered Species Act in court, and specifically the United States Supreme Court? So I'm going to do a quick tour for you of the cases that have been there and the one that's there now. And I want to suggest that in the case of the Endangered Species Act, in virtually every single federal environmental law on the books, we would not have environmental law in this country without the courts, without citizens forcing the issue at every juncture. We would not have toxic regulation under the Clean Water Act. We would not have the prevention of significant deterioration under the Clean Air Act. We wouldn't have the National Environmental Policy Act at least buying time for people to change the political and economic dynamics of the forces that are destroying nature piece by piece. The fact that we have had access to the courts, it's not been easy. And certainly the late Justice Scalia made it as hard as it could possibly be to get into the courthouse. The fact is we have beaten down the doors and got into the courthouse and succeeded more often than not. And Jason and his colleagues that are fighting the good fight every day in Washington, D.C. and all across the country are the first line of green defense in this battle for trying to save what nature has given us in all of its glory. The first case involving an endangered species didn't involve the Endangered Species Act per se. It involved a little critter called the devil's hole pupfish that, interestingly enough, was saved by an executive order designating a national monument under the Antiquities Act, an act that has been used to save probably more of nature's most special places, wild places, than any other law in the books, even the Wilderness Act. And so this case involved the designation of this small pool in Death Valley for the benefit of this little guy, and each one of these species tells a story. They're all just, each one of them is a fascinating story. You hear about the canary in the coal mine and all that stuff. It's true. They are indicator species, sentinel species, but they also have a fascinating life history. So this little guy, his particular habitat requirement and specialty is he lives in this deep pool in the desert, and he spawns on a ledge. And so how does he get to the ledge? He has to use the rising water table, the groundwater, to get to the ledge to spawn and reproduce. Well, what do you suppose was happening to the groundwater? What do you think is happening to the groundwater everywhere in the United States? It's called mining. We're basically mining ice age water left as fast as possible, the Colorado Plateau, everywhere. And so the ranchers around this area were drawing down the groundwater. I mean, the pumping was occurring miles and miles and miles away from this little cave. But it was sucking down the cone of depression, is what the hydrogeologists call it, sucking down, dropping water tables all through this entire fascinating desert ecosystem. That's where the little guys live. You can go there and peek into the hole and see if you can find them. And as usual, with any controversy involving endangered species, there are those who think the pupfish has a right to exist, regardless of its commercial value, regardless of its aesthetic appeal, regardless of whether anybody ever sees it at all. It has a right to be. But then there are some folks who don't think that so much. That, you know, it's social utility, highest and best use, and what are these resources for, and aren't humans first, and is it always fish versus people? And so even in this early battleground, those issues were framed. The legal question in the case turned on something called the Federal Reserve Water Rights Doctrine, which goes like this. When the federal government reserves, withdraws land from entry, from public access, and creates a special designation to protect objects of scientific importance, is one of the terms. When the government does that, the Supreme Court has said it implicitly reserves the water that goes with the land that's being set aside and withdrawn and protected. Of course, without the water, no pupfish. So this was the first time the United States Supreme Court had ever addressed the question, does the Federal Reserve water rights apply to groundwater? We knew it applied to surface water. We knew it applied on Indian reservations and national parks. But we didn't know whether or not it actually extended to groundwater, and the Supreme Court said, yes, it does. So the monument designation was upheld, the water levels necessary to preserve the pupfish were maintained. And here's the thing about every critter tells a story. It turns out that once you started to control all that pumping in this area, you found out that this entire massive desert ecosystem was supported by the groundwater, including this very famous National Wildlife Refuge and places like this in Death Valley. So there are these phenomenal ephemeral ponds and pools rich with biodiversity and these gorgeous little jewels of oases in the midst of the desert. You can imagine walking 4 or 5 days and coming across this when your camel's hump was dry. So the little pupfish turned out to be indeed the indicator species for an entire ecosystem. And when the framers of the Endangered Species Act wrote that the stated purpose is to preserve the ecosystems upon which endangered species depend, little did they know that is exactly what the result of this case was, to preserve an entire desert ecosystem. You all know this one. Nobody can get through law school, I don't think, without this one. And why I didn't put a Snell darter in there, and my friend Allers and my friend Zig Blatter's picture, I don't know. I threw this together too quickly. So we don't need to talk a lot about this, I don't think, except to say there's never been a more powerful environmental decision ever by any court, where the Supreme Court said the preservation of this silly little fish, Persona tenaci, required the stoppage of a dam that was 95% complete by the time the case reached the United States Supreme Court, because the law was written in a way that it admits of no exception, and that closing the gates on the dam would, at the time understood, extirpate the species, destroy its critical habitat. In fact, the thought was the species only existed in this last free-flowing stretch of the Little Tennessee River, so it would be globally extinct at the closing of the gates. And no matter how much money had been spent, and no matter how many of the benefits that TVA claimed, wrongly, for the dam, the law stripped the courts of any equitable power to balance away, in a social utility kind of calculation, the benefits of the project versus the benefits of the species. No. Species preservation über alles. The most comprehensive, powerful wildlife conservation statute in the world, said Mr. Chief Justice Berger. We know the footnote to the story, which is the Congress ended up creating, first of all, the Endangered Species Committee, Exemption Committee review process, the one we affectionately call the God Squad. And we know that the God Squad met to consider the exemption for Tellico Dam, and it took, I think, Ollie, it took maybe 60 seconds, 90 seconds. Secretary Babbitt made the motion. The God Squad committee is cabinet level with one state representative. And Secretary Babbitt was the chair. He's the Secretary of Interior. Not Babbitt, Andrus. Age catching up with me. Secretary Andrus made the motion. So, committee, what's your pleasure? And it was Charles Schultz, the chairman of the Council on Economic Advisors, who said, I don't know anything about endangered species, but I know a turkey when I see one. And if you just calculated what it would cost to finish this project, whether it's 5% or 3% or whatever, you'll never make the money back. Far better to leave this pristine, agricultural, historic valley, the home of the Cherokee Nation, Tonassi, under the reservoir at TVA versus Hill. Much better to develop this valley and protect the landowners who've been here for many generations for its agriculture, its historic value, the gateway to the Great Smokies National Park, etc., ecotourism, fishing, all of that. Said Charles Schultz, it's much better and economically more in the national interest to stop this dam, take the concrete out of the river, and leave it alone. Once again, the critter told the story. Stupid idea, bad politics, pork barrel reasoning. Which way do you think Congress went? Total failure. Total failure of democracy. Jimmy Carter, president, Jimmy Carter fading, Jimmy Carter sitting in front of the fire with his sweater on, Jimmy Carter being attacked by the marsh rabbit in his canoe, Jimmy Carter, for all of his promise and great instincts and integrity, a failing president, blanched at the last minute, could have vetoed it, didn't. Dam was finished. But the decision is a remarkable decision. Really a one of a kind. No other court decision I can think of in the United States. You can look abroad in other places and see even more dramatic decisions, but in the United States, remarkable decision. Then we go to the old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest, the late Cyril stage, Douglas fir-dominated domain of the Strix occidentalis carina, the northern spotted owl, and about 1,000 other species that are associated with a mature, healthy, old-growth ecosystem, yes, including 27 different runs of Pacific salmon, nearly all of which are listed as threatened, and in a few cases endangered under the Endangered Species Act. So this was a case about whether or not the prohibition in the statute under Section 9 dealing with take of species, hunt, wound, kill, trap, harm, harass. So this was a decision looking at the definition of harm within the definition of take, which is prohibited under the Endangered Species Act without a permit. And the successive secretaries of Interior had interpreted by rule this term harm to include habitat loss, habitat modification. at least to the point where it actually injures species by interfering with their essential behavioral characteristics: feeding, breeding, sheltering. And so this was a case brought in the name of Sweet Home, this little logging town in Oregon, but financed, of course, by the timber industry and the irrigators in the Klamath Basin. And it was a facial challenge to the rule. It was a challenge that said, under no circumstances could Congress ever have intended the word harm to include something as indirect as cutting trees and modifying this old-growth habitat of this particular species of bird, the northern spotted owl. And in a narrow decision, 6-3, with a strong concurrence by Justice O'Connor, the court actually, in a majority opinion written by Justice Stevens, upheld the rule under Chevron, step 2, analysis of, well, the term harm isn't defined in the statute, wasn't really explained in the legislative history. Congress seemed to have left the decision of how to define these key terms to the Secretary of Interior. The Secretary of Interior has done so in a way that's at least reasonable in some circumstances, maybe not all circumstances, but there's at least some situations where habitat destruction could definitely actually injure or kill a species. And some of the examples they use, like a turtle that relies on the last known pond where the turtle exists. You drain the pond, and maybe you see the turtles for a few days, but you know the fate of the turtle. And so that was enough to save this challenge, the rule from a facial challenge. The subtext of this case, though, has created lots of questions about just how significant must the adverse modification, destruction of habitat be in order to rise to the level of an actual take, an actual injury. And what has come down pretty much is you have to identify an individual critter, an individual member of the endangered species that is going to be harmed to a substantial likelihood by whatever activity it is that you're alleging. Now, this activity could be carried out by private sector interests, corporations, timber companies, mining companies, irrigators, but it can also cover states and cities and counties and tribes. All of these sort of vicarious liability decisions have been rendered under Section 9, and the harm rule has been used, not nearly as comprehensively, perhaps, as a lot of people thought it might. I mean, after all, Section 9 applies to everyone, not just the federal government, not just government itself, but everyone, individuals, companies, corporations, as I say, virtually everyone. So the Supreme Court once again reaffirmed the driving force of the Endangered Species Act is to actually not only protect the critters themselves, but their habitat. Then we took a kind of a detour a little bit, side channel. Bennett versus Speer involves the Klamath. That's the mouth of the Klamath. This is, of course, Chinook salmon country. The salmon will come to the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Northern California at the mouth of the Klamath. And they will stage there in great numbers. And they are waiting for something. What do you think the something might be? A sign from God? They're waiting for a pulse of fresh, cold water to come down the river and hit the estuarine waters. That's their ecological cue that there's enough water in the river to swim 700 miles to spawn where they began. Because that's the thing about salmon. They are cued to the exact salmon bed where they were born. And they swim when the time is right to get to that place. The Bennett case basically said, who gets to challenge a biological opinion that says you have to leave enough water in the river so the fish can get up there without motorbikes? And the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, which share responsibilities for salmonids, said you basically, Bureau of Reclamation, you basically have to leave more water in the river. We're seeing massive die-offs, and if you have a one year class of salmon loss, that's 10 years worth of salmon to rebuild that run. So these are high stakes kinds of biological threats you're dealing with. In this case said, that biological opinion can be challenged by the irrigators. And so this is Mr. Justice Scalia. He who said you don't get to come into court to challenge an action that threatens elephants in India that you have visited only one time unless you have not only plans to return and see it again, but a ticket to do so. So a very, very strict test when it came to environmentalists challenging the failure of the government to enforce the Endangered Species Act. Here, Mr. Justice Scalia turned it around and said, and I think ranchers should be able to challenge a biological opinion that goes too far protecting the species. And perhaps the ranchers can point out that they don't need as much water as they claim, and so forth and so on. So this is a procedural decision, a standing decision, an access to court decision. But it also said that biological opinions are subject to challenge by either side. Those who think they're too strong or too stringent, and those who think they're not. So the net result of this was, again, access to the courts to allow challenges. I'm going to go quickly now, ring out. Got to get to the frog. I'll just say this. This was a little kind of an oddball case. So this is about when EPA approves the delegation of the permit authority under the Clean Water Act, the NPDES, Wastewater Discharge Authority. And up until this case, the EPA had consulted with the Fish and Wildlife Service when they approved state delegations. And in this case, the Ninth Circuit had said, you didn't consult and you didn't protect some of the water-related species in Arizona. The Supreme Court said EPA didn't really have any discretion to deny the delegation because the Clean Water Act specifies 9 things, 9 items, checklist. And everybody agrees that all those 9 things, all those 9 boxes were checked by EPA. And at that point, there's no discretion left to EPA to consider endangered species. The provision at issue in the Clean Water Act doesn't say anything about the endangered species. We're not going to read that in. We're not going to add a 10th requirement. The Endangered Species Act doesn't apply because the Clean Water Act mandates approval. Lots of concern about that case, about how broadly would that sweep. It turns out not so broad. It's been limited by the courts that have interpreted it since then to being a statute has to be really, really clear about a mandatory duty to strip any consideration of endangered species. This case involves whales, and we're going to be hearing much more from our distinguished keynote speaker on this. This is a case involving injunctive relief. This is a question about when can a court, having found a violation of federal law, in this case both NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, and the Endangered Species Act, what should a court do when it finds a violation? Remember, TVA versus Hill said, if we are faced with a clear violation of the Endangered Species Act, we have no choice but to enjoin it. Well, times have changed. The court has changed. And now the wisdom of the United States Supreme Court is, even where you've got a clear, obvious violation of federal law by the federal government, in this case the Navy, conducting sonar testing in the oceans, and even though we know what sonar testing does to beings that communicate by sonar, it's not enough to show that there's real impacts to these species. You have to show that the impacts rise to a level of irreparable harm to the entire species, not to individuals. The entire species must be at risk to show irreparable harm. And plus, even when you have that, you have to balance the equities. And here what they're talking about is the Navy isn't just playing games here. The Navy is conducting vital national security, military preparedness drills in the ocean. And if the consequence is a few whales have their brains blown up, we need to protect the nation at all costs. This case has created problems in other contexts as well. Jason already mentioned our little friend, the Utah prairie dog. This was a high moment. The Endangered Species Act has been challenged constitutionally no less than 12 times as an excess of the Commerce Clause authority of the Congress. And every single case has gone the way of the Endangered Species Act. It's a clean sweep. It's a remarkable record involving some very strange cavemen, bugs and caves and so forth, beetles and spiders and all that. And so here the 10th Circuit wrote a very strong opinion, again upholding the constitutionality of the Endangered Species Act. The Supreme Court has denied review in Commerce Clause cases 5 times. That brings us to the gopher frog, because that was an issue in Markle. Oh, well, quickly, the bearded seal. Isn't he cool? So I'll just quickly mention, this is a 9th Circuit decision, again, cert denied this time around by the Supreme Court. And these guys, of course, are part of the unraveling Arctic ecosystem. And the issue here is when you're considering remote threats like climate change to species that are currently abundant, but that are screwed over the long haul, how far out into the future can you go? The agencies used to go 50 years. That was the limit of the horizon of evaluating threat and endangerment. Now they go 100. So the question here was, can the agencies actually take into account the effects of climate change at the end of the century on these various Arctic species? And the answer was yes. Yes, they can. The science is there. The law is clear. So now we're to the frog, and I only have a few minutes. We could talk maybe Q&A. This is a classic. You know, Jason mentioned, by the time species get listed, it's almost too late. So here's a critter that spends most of his life underground, breeds in ephemeral pools for a very good reason. There are no fish in ephemeral pools. So there are no piscivores. There are no predatory fish, so therefore when they lay their eggs in these ponds, they won't get eaten by fish. So they must have isolated wetlands, the very kinds of wetlands that Mr. Justice Scalia said are not protected under the Clean Water Act, and not just him, but others, including the current administrator of EPA. So this frog was prevalent throughout Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. That's its stronghold. Longleaf loblolly pine forest. It breeds in these pools, these isolated pools, and then it spends the rest of its life underground in a forest matrix that has a particular sort of structure and canopy and all that kind of stuff. There are only maybe 150 of these guys left. All of them in Mississippi. They've been wiped out everywhere else. Over 95% of their historic range and habitat and distribution gone. Classic emergency room, ICU, life support situation. This case involves designation of critical habitat. The Endangered Species Act was amended in 1978 to distinguish between occupied critical habitat and unoccupied critical habitat. I remember this discussion. And the idea of the unoccupied is, well, if we just look at occupied habitat and it's already so small, postage stamp kind of thing, the species are screwed. We know what inbreeding does. It's called the extinction vortex. So you must simply expand the range of species in order to recover them. Maybe you can hang on to them for some period of time by maintaining where they currently exist. But if you want them to recover, if you want them to be delisted, if you want a success, they've got to expand. So this Fish and Wildlife Service started out by saying we're going to designate the places where we know they still exist. There are a few places in Mississippi. And we're going to stop there. But the service also has what's called a peer review process. They do this for everything. And yes, in fact, the service does care about science. So when they put it out for the peer review, two different rounds of peer review, the peer reviewers said, no, you cannot limit the critical habitat designation to where they are. That's a recipe for extinction. So you're going to have to search the historic range and find the best available habitat. It may not be perfect, it may not be great habitat, but whatever it is, if it at least has this essential component of the ephemeral pools, and if perhaps you have to restore the matrix area around the pools in order to make it truly suitable and habitable, then okay. But if you want to recover this species, say the scientists, the experts, you have to do that. So that's what the Fish and Wildlife Service did. It searched far and wide, up and down, all over the historic range, and it found one last little 1,500-acre parcel in St. Tammany Parish owned by Markle and Weyerhaeuser. Service hates to designate critical habitat on private property. Politically doesn't like that. Designation of critical habitat by itself doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean anything. Doesn't require you to do anything or not to do anything. Doesn't matter in terms of the take prohibition, whether it's critical habitat or just habitat. So that's not a trigger. If there is some form of federal involvement, a federal permit, a federal license, federal money, now you have Section 7, now you have consultation, now you have a biological opinion, now you have at least the possibility that there could be some restrictions on development of the property. But that's all in the future, that's all speculative. Nothing about this particular parcel that I've seen, and I've looked at all the shape files, tells me there's any form of federal involvement whatsoever in this particular property. So the opportunity or the risk that there would be some significant restriction on the plans that Weyerhaeuser and Markle have for development, speculative. Maybe not ridiculous, but speculative to be sure. And so this is now teed up in the Supreme Court. The question the court's going to have to answer is, we know that you can designate unoccupied habitat, but does that unoccupied habitat have to have some reasonable, provable prospect that will ever be occupied, that will ever be valuable to the conservation? Or can you simply designate it as a possible future opportunity to recover the species? So how broad is the authority of the service and the secretary to designate unoccupied habitat that isn't currently suitable and for which the frogs are a long way away, more than a bus ride, to get there? So that's, in brief, the legal question that's posed. Lots of amicus briefs being filed, including some that I'm working on, and we'll see what happens. And Jason. So sorry I ran over. I'm known for that. Thank you for your patience.
Thanks to both the panelists. I could listen to this go on and on. It's fascinating. And a case very close to home. The sign-in sheets, we need to know where those are, so make sure they get back to the front, maybe pick them up. And there is a little bit of time for questions. Maybe the two speakers could come up here and take questions directed to one or the other of them by questioners. Here's a question.
I have a question about the Gopher Frog case. We are an intervener in that case. We were the original intervener for CBD. So I'm a little confused by the opinion because the original challenge was not by Markle, it was by Poitevin. Poitevin was not, the cert was not granted for Poitevin, but it was granted for Markle. So I have to admit, as a litigant, I'm a little confused by what the Supreme Court has done.
The procedural posture.
Yeah, because the landowner did not succeed in his appeal. He did have development. I'm with the Gulf Restoration.
Okay.
He did have development plans. The lease by Weyerhaeuser is for 20 years. So to me, it's like the posture is very confusing, and the Supreme Court seems to have limited what it's willing to take and what it's not. But so I'm asking y'all that question since.
The reason they took the case is because the guy who wrote the cert petition, Tim Bishop, knows how to write cert petitions, number one. So he framed it as a property rights issue. And number two, it was an en banc decision by the Fifth Circuit with 8 dissents, and a very strong dissent by Owens, Patricia Owens. So I think what grabbed the attention, the clerks are the ones that screen and decide actually what gets served. I think what caught their eye was those elements. I don't think they looked at the procedural posture question and the real party and interest question very closely. That sometimes develops as a case gets processed and briefed, and sometimes the court actually decides this is not a very good vehicle for whatever it is some of the justices may think it is. I wouldn't be surprised to see something like that happen. I'm not necessarily predicting
Well, I mean, we
victory.
were a little shocked that they took it.
Yeah,
because,
well,
I mean,
everybody was shocked.
The judge at the district court level, if people don't know, was the most reluctant decider in this. I mean, he said, if I could find any other way than to make this decision, if I thought there was any way I could interpret the law. I mean, he's the least friendly U.S. district judge in the nation.
Well, you ruled the right way.
Right.
So there were 2 cert petitions, I believe, filed in this case. One was by the Markle plaintiffs and one was by the Weyerhaeuser plaintiffs. And they were largely the same, but Markle's petition had an additional claim, which was that protection of the dusky gopher frog was unconstitutional under the Commerce Clause. They didn't take that petition. They took the Weyerhaeuser petition. The Weyerhaeuser petition did not include a Commerce Clause challenge. So I regard that at least as a signal that, as with the cert denial in the Petpo case, the Supreme Court is not interested in evaluating the ESA under the Commerce Clause. The 2 questions presented that they did take, though, one is this issue of how far the service can go with respect to unoccupied habitat that's designated on private lands. And the second one, which is interesting, is whether a determination not to exclude an area from critical habitat designation is reviewable. Because the way the statute is written, a Secretary of Interior may exclude areas from critical habitat that he or she deems to not warranted because it might be too economically significant. But if the Secretary doesn't do that, is that discretionary? And I think courts don't like, the Supreme Court does not like to be told that something is unreviewable. So it could very well be that that's the issue, and that the decision that we end up getting is, yeah, well, of course a determination not to exclude an area on economic grounds is reviewable. Or it could be something more sweeping that cuts at the heart of the amount of habitat that one can designate under critical habitat. And of course, I'm sure some of the amicus briefs will end up raising the Commerce Clause question. The court could go there, but I think that they sent a pretty strong signal they're not interested in that.
The controlling authority on whether an agency with discretionary authority can be challenged for failing to exercise it is Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance SUA case, and it was a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court saying you cannot challenge the failure to exercise a discretionary duty. That's a decision, frankly, that's two-edged.
Yeah.
If the Supreme Court decides in its wisdom that failure to exercise discretionary authority is reviewable, there will be lots of challenges left and right to the Trump administration for lots of decisions not to exercise authorities they have, like vetoing permits and so forth.
Yeah.
There's a provision that was put in one of the spending bills recently that will provide a faster track for approval of the mid-Barataria sediment diversion in Louisiana. And the fast track is requiring the National Marine Fisheries Service to move quickly on determining whether or not the diversion would affect dolphins that were determined to be injured by the BP oil spill. The diversion is being built as a restoration project in part to damage from the oil spill. And it's specific aimed at the takings question. Is that something that's going to end up in court, do you think? Is that the kind of thing that could end up in court?
First thing, I don't know a thing about that project, so I'll start with that, and then I'll talk about it. I'm assuming that's a Marine Mammal Protection Act issue, because I don't know if the dolphins in question are endangered, so that's going to fall under an MMPA.
Well, they were determined to be damaged by the BP oil
Right.
spill. And
But this is a
under
congressional
MMPA.
rider you're talking about?
Yeah, so I-
Congressional right.
Now, the
It's a
Supreme
specific
Court has said that.
population. It's a specific population that is linked to that specific area that they say would not be able to move.
I mean, the answer to that is if Congress passes it and the President signs it or doesn't veto it, it's law.
So, I mean,
Period.
NIMS has to do an analysis quicker, or did they just strip their review? I don't know. So what we're seeing lately
It's
is like,
quicker, but it's a review that would
It
take a while.
essentially says that the project will move forward no matter what.
Yeah.
And the scientists say that that population of dolphins will die. So it's...
Yeah, I mean, we have a long history going back to the Alaska pipeline of the Congress saying, we deem the pipeline finished and the law is complied with and that's the end of it. And
Yeah.
the Supreme Court has always upheld that.
yeah, I don't think they had.
Court stripping bills, court stripping provisions have been upheld in the old growth forest battles and many, many times.
Ollie?
Yeah, if this were, going back to the economic issue, probably the narrower issue that the court will rule on, and the reviewability of their decision not to exclude on economic grounds. The base of this, is it not, when you designate CRITHAB, you have to do an economic analysis.
Yep.
Okay? So those analyses are reviewable, not reviewable by courts. It seems to me that, do you have any precedent for reviewing the economic analysis of
Yeah.
the designation of occupied habitat?
Yeah, there is case law on that, and the issue turns on this. When you list a species, as Jason mentioned, the Endangered Species Act mandates that the listing decision itself can be based solely on biological factors, no economics, and that's been upheld forever. When it comes to critical habitat, then, the question is, what kind of an economic analysis can you do about the incremental impact of designating critical habitat on top of the listing decision, which is insulated from economic analysis? And that gave the courts total headache for a while. Now they've settled on, it is in fact an incremental analysis. So for the gopher frog, the economic analysis goes from 0 to 34 million. So how does that happen? Well, the answer is it's 0 if there's no federal involvement. You see?
Speculative.
It's speculative. So the economic analysis, Ollie, in the gopher frog case says, let's assume there is some kind of federal control, and that federal control prohibits any development whatsoever. Let's just assume that. Now, frankly, that's nuts. Okay? So if a court, the Supreme Court did not frame the review of the economic analysis per se. They framed the, is your decision not to exclude reviewable? That's the only review cert question posed. Not, is the underlying economic analysis itself valid or invalid? I could see a case where a court could say, I don't understand an economic analysis that says it could be nothing or it could be everything. I don't get that.
Did the service give make an administrative record on their reasons not to exclude?
No. No. Did not.
Well, that's in your case.
Did not.
Is that a tactical error, you think?
I don't know. It's a slippery slope.
I haven't seen the
If
record.
they made that decision in a formal way, then that would be APA challengeable, wouldn't it?
They base the critical, they really are standing on the ground that their peer-reviewed science is saying
That it's essential.
yeah.
But that doesn't deal with the not carving it out. Or is essential mean you can't carve it out because it's essential?
Well, it is tautology, but here's what I think the service is saying is we can't exclude it. It's the only, and this is what the record says, this is the only habitat we've been able to identify that could possibly be
Okay.
useful to the species. The only one.
Got it.
These pools are quite unique, and this is the only complex in the entire historic range of the frog that's left, right?
Right.
It's it.
Well, there's one existing functional breeding pond, and then there was this one set of ephemeral ponds that might be able to be, to be morphed into a breeding pond.
And we're
It's
part of the
probably
historical
very
range of the species.
Yeah.
One final question. Worst case, what would the Supreme Court do? The 5 on the Supreme Court that would do it.
Say that the government has a burden of proving that there's some realistic probability that this habitat could actually be useful to the species within the reasonable foreseeable future. That's my reading.
why wouldn't it be?
Why wouldn't what be?
Why would it not be? Because the landowner would prevent the service from doing it.
And that's what the landowners have said.
Okay. So there's no reasonable possibility because we landowners are not going to let that possibility happen.
Exactly.
Their argument is that this is not habitat because it only contains some of the features necessary for the survival
That's a
of the frog.
different argument.
It is a different argument.
If the argument is that this is not essential because they're never going to let you make it good habitat, if that's their argument,
Well, I think those two go together because the argument that this is not currently habitat depends on it then somehow becoming habitat. So what they're
Right.
basically saying then is that a private landowner has a veto
over
over
whether
whether something
it
can be
becomes.
critical habitat based on their present willingness to do something that
Yeah.
would make it better
Okay.
habitat.
Yeah,
And
there's something
I think
nasty
that's,
about
I mean,
that.
who knows who's going to own that property
Yeah.
in the future? There are landowners who are doing good things for wildlife. If that's what it is, then we're not going to be able to designate a lot of critical habitat.
Recovery plans can take 50 years.
Right.
So that's the other way to think about it.
I think
Thanks
we
so much.
need
Yeah.
to end this
Yeah,
session.
thank you.
So people can go to lunch, but thanks to speakers. And you can come up and talk to the speakers after the session.